O winter, bar thine adamantine doors, the north is thine. There hast thou built thy dark, deep-founded habitation. Shake not thy roofs, nor bend thy pillars with thine iron car. William Blake. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. If this is your first week, welcome. Please enjoy and go back and listen to the back catalog if you like it, and subscribe. And for those joining again, thank you for returning. I hope you are having a good week and enjoyed last week's episode. This week, we're going to be talking about and probably finishing up kind of the remaining region of Asia, this North Asia, Siberia, what have you. So this is the vast northern portion that runs essentially from the Pacific Ocean to the Ural Mountains in the west. Now we will be returning to the DNA study laid out by Melinda Yang that we've used the last couple of episodes that goes over the various humans who have been in this region and have coalesced into at least 3, possibly 4 broad hereditary groups. Now, this is just genetically speaking. They were probably much more diverse linguistically and culturally speaking. Also, there were probably groups that were some ratio or combination between these groups, and possibly some smaller groups we don't have genetic evidence of just yet. Now, those genetic groups are the Amur, the ancient North Siberians, the Paleo-Siberians, and possibly the steppe ancestry. At least that's what they're referred to as by Yang. Now, I'll deal with the steppe ancestry group first, because I can already hear you asking, what do you mean possibly? This has been found with the DNA evidence, right? Yes. However, the oldest example of extractable DNA belonging to this broad genetic group dates to around 3000 BC. It's probably older than that, but it is a mix of a number of older genetic lineages, some of which wouldn't have been able to mix together until right at the start of our current season. Remember how I mentioned much of Central Asia would be hard to cross safely or live in large numbers and would have left groups largely isolated. This group emerges right in the border regions of the Central and Western Eurasian steppe, the Caucasus, Siberia, and Central Asia, the very far west, essentially, of Northern Asia. So this group is a mixture of hunter-gatherers from the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, people moving north from Iran in the Middle East, through the now more hospitable Central Asia. And from the next group, we will focus on the ancient North Siberians. So it's possible that this group is emerging right now, but my guess is it's probably sometime just after our current season. So right around 6000 BC to a little bit after. You're probably seeing a lot more migration into the regions and groups kind of reforming and forming into something new. But to get back to it, we will focus on, again, the ancient North Siberians. These are one of the population groups that will contribute or are contributing to the steppe ancestry. Now, this is probably the oldest lineage of Homo sapiens to reach North Asia, or one of the oldest, if not the oldest. The oldest DNA found belonging to this group dates to around 33,000 years ago. And this was found near the Yana River. This is in the far north of the Sakha Republic region of Russia. And this feeds into the Siberian Sea portion of the Arctic Ocean. So And there are more recent remains dated to this group that were found further south near Lake Baikal, and they were dated to multiple periods, some as old as 24,000 years ago, and some as recent as 17,000 years ago. Now, I wasn't able to geolocate where these remains were found exactly, but using Google Maps and its measuring tool, I found that the Yana enters into the sea, and the northeast shores of Lake Baikal is around 1,300 miles from each other, which is around 2,100 kilometers. So I think it's safe to say that these people had very large range. And what these people had to suffer through to survive during the various climatic shifts happening, all through this time period, must have been brutal, especially during the Younger Dryas. The regions they would have occupied would have been, a mix of deep forests and kind of North Siberia. To the south, you would have rocky hills and even deserts in some places in the west of what is now Mongolia, and the various steppes to the east and west of that region. And they would follow in the wake of various, wild herds, eating what those herds ate for the most part, with the exception of just the basis of grasses. Obviously, humans can't really digest that. And they would have been hunting those animals for food, furs, skin, bone, what have you. And these herds would have included wild deer, antelope, things similar to goats, ungulates, of course wild horses, very important, as well as mammoths, which of course have steadily become, or would have steadily been becoming rarer and rarer. Because speaking of mammoths, more and more evidence shows that these creatures lasted later than we initially believed. I know when I was in grade school, the popular consensus is that they had mostly gone extinct around 10,000 BC. Of course, this was thrown into question during the mid to late 90s when remains were found on Wrangel Island. This island is located in modern Russia's far east. It sits in the Chukchi Sea region of the Arctic Ocean, so a little bit further east than where the Yana River enters out to the sea. And this island contains mammoths that had been isolated from the mainland and lived on the island right up until around 2000 BC. And they had been isolated for so long they had even begun to develop insular dwarfism. And of course, since then, finds in the mid-2000s showed that some had lived on St. Paul Island in Alaska until around 3,800 BC. And in a paper, I think that showed up in Nature in October of 2021, Wang et al. Showed that there is substantial evidence that it's possible that mammoths survived much later than previously thought on mainland Asia and North America, with them lasting in Siberia to about 5,300 and North America up to around 6,500 BC. Now, the ancient North Siberian groups were not the only group in this region. There were also the Paleo-Siberians. They occupied more of the Pacific region of North Asia, but they did span back towards Baikal and Mongolia as well, though they probably wouldn't have gotten quite as far west as the ancient North Siberians. And these people were a mixture of either a breakaway group of ancient North Siberians or their immediate predecessors. So, say either the North Siberians had a split, or there's some precursor population that split into two, and one of those became the ANS group, and the other became the Paleo-Siberians, which Also, this group that became the Paleo Siberians, they would have mixed probably some with a group coming up from East Asia at a point known as the Tian Yuan lineage. I won't be talking about them much. They've disappeared by the point in our season we're getting to. But they would have been mixing in with both the ancient North Siberians and the Paleo Siberians. But they probably weren't that numerous, at least in general. They were kind of a breakaway from the rest of the East Asians in what is now modern China. In terms of lifestyle, the Paleo Siberians were very similar to the North Siberians, but I'm sure groups on the coast had access to more maritime resources, like obviously you have fish in the river, but you would have larger fish you could catch and pull from the sea. Of course, you have access to a lot more shells, not to mention seals. Seals are a very important source of protein for a lot of peoples living in these colder climates. Not just for their meat, but also their furs and their fats and things like that. And I should note that there was plenty of mixture between the North Siberians and the Paleo Siberians. By and large, these groups, they are, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. They are distinct, but you can see that there is a certain level of intermixing, probably obviously in the regions that they cohabitated. Whether this was done peacefully or not, obviously it's up for debate. I would imagine that there was some very peaceful coexistence, and in some cases probably not. That's just, kind of the way things work. Although with the climate, I'm inclined to think it may have been slightly more peaceful in this region than in others. It's probably easier to have good neighbors, to team up, to have these large hunts in terms of, just getting as much meat as possible. It's probably easier working with larger groups than not. Also, during the winter, when hunter-gatherer groups tend to kind of coalesce together, you obviously have smaller bands during most of the year, but then when the weather turns worse, they tend, hunter-gatherer groups tend to band together to pull resources and to try to get hunting and things like that done, where it's harder to do. More hands make better work, that kind of thing. And there's probably some level of sharing pooled resources from different regions, to kind of make the time go easier. And of course, you do have to marry off your children to non-related or not as closely related children as well. So that is something that you have to keep in mind. And this is something that happens throughout pretty much the entirety of this period that we're talking about. Now, again, keep in mind that this is just genetically, culturally, linguistically. These groups are probably much more diverse than what we know. It wouldn't surprise me if groups occupying the same river systems would be more closely related linguistically than, say, maybe genetically, if these two groups are occupying different sections of a river or different shores of Lake Baikal. Just keep that in mind. The final group I need to mention is the Amur River group. The oldest person with this DNA pattern is from 14,000 years ago. These people occupied the southern portion of North Asia, I guess, and they have been found around the southern shores of Lake Baikal. They don't get quite as far north as the Paleo-Siberians or the ancient North Siberians, but they do get further west than the Paleo-Siberians and further east than the ancient North Siberians. And they also get further south than both of those groups. Now, the first Americans were descendants from these three groups, and as we briefly mentioned last time, there was still, or I say last time, as I briefly mentioned in the last season's episode on North America, there is evidence that shows that there was back migration of some Native American ancestors, and at a couple of periods of time where they went back and intermixed with these earlier Asian populations before they permanently separated. Though it is still debated if these back migrations happened after they got isolated in Beringia, but before they moved into North America, or if it happened after they moved into North America, or at least I should say if it happened after they moved into Alaska and then moved back into Alaska, and from there moved south to the Americas. But we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit more later this season when we get to the Americas. Again, it's one of those things that, is kind of debated, and it might come up naturally, it might not. I have to shoehorn it in there. Now, very little of the ancient North Siberians, Paleo-Siberians, or the steppe ancestry impacts modern East Asian and Southeast Asian DNA. There's a little in some places, but it's not over the entire portion or peoples living in those regions. But this was probably due to the fact that these people were probably never very numerous in the grand scheme of human population. And this is due, of course, to the environment being as harsh as it is. But it's also because the Amur groups probably filtered interactions with the groups south of them and the groups north of them, serving as basically middlemen for any trade between the regions. Of course, the Amur do impact the rest of Asia's DNA. This is due to the various tribal confederations that emerge in the region later, like the Xiongnu, the Mongols, etc. And of course, probably earlier than that, the Amur probably were involved at some level with the first groups in the northern Chinese plain area, as well as with the people that move into Korea after the Julman period. But again, more on that in future episodes. Now, unfortunately, there isn't much I can talk about with these peoples when it comes to things like culture or linguistics. Linguistically, we don't really know, what the kind of tongues these people would speak. There are, of course, language families associated with the region, and there are several different ones. But I think from what I can see, most linguists agree that these languages don't really become a thing until later, or at least not anything that's identifiable. And there's a lot of talk about trying to connect the languages of the modern families that are spoken and trying to maybe merge them into a larger family or see how they related to each other. It's a mess for a number of reasons. Partly because some of the groups that had existed, at least into recorded history, have been disappeared. Either they died out or they were absorbed by other groups, or that they were just straight up killed by either the Mongols or the Russians or the Chinese or what have you. But again, that's all stuff for the future. But we do have, obviously their tools, which don't really stand out comparatively to anyone else's. There's nothing that really makes them unique. But we do have, in part of, I believe it's western Siberia, closer towards the Ural Mountains, the earliest monumental ritual art has been found. And by monumental, I think they just mean, just large scale. Like, obviously they had votives and small carvings of things like that. That's not anything out of the ordinary for anyone else, much like tool stuff. But even before Göbekli Tepe, which again you saw 4-meter tall stone stele, the people in this region were carving 5-meter tall larchwood figures. Now, wood is not the same as stone, but again, 5 meters, we're talking 16 feet, give or take. So they are cutting down these large trees or largish trees, and then stripping bark, and then them treating them and carving them to resemble very human figures. Unlike the Göbekli Tepe ruins, which, if those T-pillars are meant to represent humanity, the larchwood figures are much more straightforward. They have human faces. They have these very intricate lines kind of carved through them or around them, kind of in a very patterned design. So, they do have their own kind of Neolithic artwork, not architecture, but their own kind of special spiritual practices that is fairly unique. And I believe that these were posited to have kind of been built in kind of a circular pattern, all kind of grouped together. Although there are some people that say that they were kind of spread out a little bit more, and maybe each had their own region. And to go back, obviously there is a lot of attempts to kind of connect modern indigenous groups living in the area to their modern rituals to their ancient ones. I don't know if I'd quite go that far. I definitely think there is a decent amount of overlap, but how they're living, what they're living on, might have changed a good bit, especially with the mammoths dying out. Mammoths are very important. Mammoth hunting isn't something that you'd be doing all the time, even when there's a lot of them. There's probably just brief periods in the year where you're undertaking that. But mammoth bones are very important for a lot of permanent structures. Wood, things like that, you probably wouldn't use it for anything large scale because you need so much fuel for fire. So mammoth bone is something that's very, very important. Especially, I didn't really go into it too much, but there are some places in Eastern Europe from the last, kind of glacial maximum period that used large scale circular bones or layouts, and then basically set up walls made out of mammoth bones and tusks, and then they would cover them with furs, things like that. And something similar, I'm sure, was done in this region as well, because again, in the winter you can't really move freely in this region. You'd have to move further south, and if you had to remain in this region, you'd want as sturdy and as thick of a barrier as possible. So there is that. Of course, you also have this is a region that's kind of known for, or at least popularly imagined to be, kind of the birthplace of shamanism In fact, the word shaman is believed to have come from I forget the specific language, but it's thought to come into Russian from one of the languages of the Siberian region. Now, that is debated, and we'll get more into that later. But, medicine men, shamans, whatever you want to call them, this is something that you see in this region last for quite a while. And while we can't prove that it existed at this point in our timeline, it is interesting to note that Native Americans have shamanistic practices as well. Their rituals are obviously different, but there is some level of overlap. So you can see that there's probably a common origin point. And of course, you have shamanistic and medicine men in sub-Saharan Africa as well, especially among the Khoi and the San. Now, we obviously can't say if this is limited to lineage or if every person practices their own type of medicine, like how you'll see in some of those sub-Saharan African places, if there are different types, acknowledged or different medicines practiced by different types of shamans, if there is an overlap between the types of medicine that shamans can practice, or if they're just limited to one variety. This is all speculation. But I'm willing to bet that they definitely had some type of precursor to shamanism. What it was called, whether or not it was actually called shamanism, or obviously it wasn't called shamanism because, again, that's a modern construction, or at least a more recent construction. But if they had people acting as shamans, whether or not they were called shaman, what have you, I'm willing to bet that, yes, it was some precursor to that, if nothing else. Another thing, dogs were probably first domesticated in this region, Siberia. And if not Siberia, it was probably somewhere in Japan when it was connected to Siberia via land bridge. So these people obviously were very good with animals, at least initially. They had to contend with wolves, so they chose to befriend them rather than just fighting them. I think that says a lot about their understanding of the animals they're having to deal with. Another animal that they're probably having to deal with that people probably don't think about too much are tigers. There are Siberian tigers. They do exist. Of course, they're very endangered these days, but a number of places across North Asia had to deal with them. Dogs would probably help with that. Dogs would probably help with hunting a lot of different game. So it's not a mystery to see why you would want to kind of cultivate that resource. Dogs were also probably good winter food. You breed a lot of them. You might have a couple of spare or deficient dogs that you might want to butcher and eat, especially during the colder winter months. As distasteful as we might find it, it's definitely something that happened. We have dog bones in a number of places. But that is to say, not to say they did not care about their dogs. I know, I think in Mongolia, there's dogs are very highly prized, especially well-trained dogs. And that kind of ties into a lot about, a lot of theories about these early animalistic or animal worshipping religions. These people did love these animals. They hunted them, they preyed on them, but they definitely respected their power. They would call on their spirits to try to draw them to them in real life, things like that. At least that's the prevailing theory. And, a dog, dogs would be seen as valuable protectors for a lot of these peoples. And they would be probably very good, their dog spirits would be very good tools in the afterlife, or for religious purposes and drawing these animal spirits to you. They would serve humans the same way in the spiritual world as they did the physical world. I can certainly see that being the case. So make of that what you will. I really wish I had a lot more to go over in terms of specifics. But I do think this is one of those regions that has had to deal with just kind of lack of focus, lack of interest, just because where it is, where it's located, how environmentally it's probably not considered like a bastion of civilization, but obviously they did make contributions. They domesticated the dog, at least initially. Dogs will become even more important. They'll be used for herding, things like that. So yeah, that's all stuff to keep in mind when thinking about this region. We will return here next season. I think I'd have to double check my notes, but it's very possible domesticated horses will come, at least in the western end of North Asia, by the end of our next season. And then, of course, they'll spread out from there. But that stuff I'll have to double check, and it's something you can look forward to. But yeah, also, I think next season, regions will get subdivided a little bit more because there are more specifics to talk about. This region, some people consider this the longest, I guess, holdout for Paleolithic cultures, because, agriculture doesn't even show up until 2500 BC, which is very late, worldwide. It's either Australia is considered Paleolithic, the longest, or this region, and then of course you enter the Neolithic. But that's up for debate. Again, those are kind of arbitrary because those terms don't 100% apply to really any one region. They're just kind of general broad terms, but we'll get into that, going forward. But yeah, I think that's a good place to start, or to stop for this week. And next week, we will be moving to Australia and kind of that region. So we'll talk about the Aboriginal people there. That might be a two-parter. Maybe three, maybe one. I've been making my notes, but there's a couple things I don't know if it quite belongs in our current time frame, or if it needs to be pushed back to the next. That's something for me to figure out, though. You just have to show up next week and listen and enjoy. If you are not subscribed on your various platforms that you're listening to me on, please do. Rate me as you see fit on those same platforms. If you have any feedback or questions, please feel free to email me at war@revpod@gmail.com, or you can reach me on Twitter, which I'll try to include the link on in the episode description. Of course, again, I am on YouTube as well. I have my podcast uploaded there. As of right now, at the same time, they're uploaded on other platforms. If Windows gets rid of their video editing software, I might have to delay publishing on YouTube by a couple of hours. Otherwise, eventually I'll replace that and get it set back up, but that might take a little bit of time. I've also been doing some other stuff on the YouTube channel. It's not quite in the same vein as this, which is just a nice educational audio podcast. It's a little bit more hectic over there, and involves some video game stuff for some things I plan on talking about during some bonus episodes going forward. But that's for October. For right now, just keep listening in for the good old-fashioned history content. So, thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a good rest of the day and a good rest of your week. Thank you all. Goodbye.